Welcome to this week's episode of Mixed Media Monday. Today I'm going to be making a tag that was for a swap that took place a couple months ago, and I'm going to be starting off with this Julie Nutting doll, and I'm putting Fun Foam underneath because I'm stamping it with StazOn and I want a nice crisp image, and the Fun Foam allows for me to have that. Then next I'm going to grab this Inkadinkado butterfly. I don't know if they sell this anymore. This is a really old classic that I just adore. And I'm going to stamp that as well, move the Fun Foam over, and make sure I get a nice, clear, crisp image. The only reason I'm using a block is because I do want the nice, clean, crisp image, and the Fun Foam and block help me with that. Then I'm going to pick out a bunch of these Prima flowers and use them for some definition and textural elements. So what I'm looking for is ones that I can create different kinds of texture with, and I'm looking for odd numbers, and I'm trying to make one big flower I can build up. And then I'm going to pick out some little tiny flowers as well just to add some more elements. So I'm looking at odd numbers. I want an odd number of each flower, and I want an odd number of selected flowers. So I will have one big flower that's layered, I will have 3 little flowers that are the same color, and then I will have 3 bigger flowers that I'm going to use for texture. Next I'm going to reach for my Color Bloom sprays, and this was recorded quite a long time ago, so I can't actually tell you what color those are, but I think that this one was called Boysenberry, maybe, perhaps, and all I'm doing is I'm making sure that the flowers are saturated, and by going through and making sure that they've picked up a lot of that color, I'm making sure there's a little bit of color variation within each flower as well. The next color I'm going to use is a yellow, and I'm going to take the little flowers and spray them with the yellow and make sure that they are saturated as well, and then put them off to the side. And then I'm going to take the bigger flowers that I'm using for texture, and I'm going to spray them with a really light pink. It's kind of a coral color. And make sure that they are saturated as well. What I did there is I sprayed the pad with a little bit of water so that I would have activated the other spray from the other flowers, and then I have a little bit of cohesion between the different flowers. The next thing I'm going to do is clean up my mess, and the way I'm going to do that is by spraying down my mat with a bit of water, and then I'm taking the tissue paper that I want to use for the background and I'm absorbing up some of that color. Now what this does is it allows me to use just random elements from around my craft space and to create a cohesive tag by making the background elements and the textural elements the same colors. And then it doesn't matter what colors I use as my focal feature as long as they're not hugely contrasting. I can put it all together and it'll seem cohesive because the background and the foreground really work well. So what I'm doing here is I am spraying from a mini mister, and this was a happy accident where I had an order sent to me and the order kind of exploded. The lid came off of one of my Lindy Stamp Gang powders. And what ended up happening is I was able to dump everything back into the container, all the powder, but that was mostly the pigment. The mica is such a fine element that it stuck to the insides of the tube of the Lindy Stamp Gang set, and it stuck to the inside of a lot of my packaging. So what I ended up doing was taking a Q-tip and wiping the inside of everything, a damp Q-tip, and then putting it in water so that it would color the water, and then I put water into the tube from the mica powders, and I shook it around and cleaned up all of that and poured it into this little mini mister tube. So because of that, it's the mica powder that sticks to the sides, not the pigment. So this is very, very fine pigment and a lot of mica into this spray. So I have to respray it over and over again in order to get the effect that I want. I did want it to be like a slight coral kind of color, but I also wanted majority just the shimmer. So this worked out perfectly for this piece. And then I'm going to go and fussy cut out these wings. This is a kind of quick process because there's not a whole lot of detail to them. The other thing too is I don't have a lot of warping of this page, and that's because I've used watercolor paper. If I had used a cardstock or some other paper, the potential would have been very high that it would have just warped and twisted just simply because of the amount of water and the number of times I sprayed it. In order to create the effect that I wanted, I did use my heat gun in tandem with the spray so that I would get spatter marks that would dry real quick and so forth. And then I just continued to cut them out until they are right where I need them to be. My next step in this process was to lay everything out and decide what I was going to do for my background. So here I'm making sure the wings are the right way up. I'm making sure the flowers are going to be laid out nicely to dry, and then I'm going to grab this girl and color her. Now I'm thinking about my background going, okay, it's going to be these colors, so I'm going to keep them close to me. And then I decided, oh well, you know what, green goes with everything. So one thing that you'll notice in my Copic coloring is that I'm not going through and grabbing a whole bunch of different colors of skin tone. I am using the same marker in order to create a degree of skin tone in there. And as each layer dries, I just keep adding another layer, and because it's all the same tone, it's going to meld together and it's going to create that washout or that shadowing look that I'm trying to achieve. And once again, I'm not using different markers. I'm using the same marker in order to achieve that shadowing effect. And I'll do that with all of my different colors as well. So here's her hair. I wanted her hair to be a darker color, but I wanted to create a base so that it would blend because I didn't want it to have defined lines in there. So I did lay down the skin tone, and then I made curly lines in here with this marker until it was all full, and then everything kind of blended itself all together. But I will go back in several times over, and I will add one step darker of color in order to create the curly impression for her hair. But it will continue to blend because the alcohol in the marker has not quite absorbed into the page yet. And then I'll just continue to go over things again and again until I have the shadowing effect that I'm looking for. Once again, this is the watercolor paper, so it is nice and absorb. It has a high level of absorption, and so it is doing exactly what I want it to do. And you can see the shadow coming in there. Now I'm reaching for this light green. This light green worked out really well. It created the shadow that I was looking for. It did exactly what I wanted it to do. And in order to create a little bit more shadow and definition in the shirt, I did end up using a darker marker afterwards in order to create the perfect, to my thought process, the perfect bit of shadow. Now the next color I'm going to use is the green for the skirt, and I did have a problem with this marker because this marker I have to wait for the ink to get into the barrel because there's something wrong with the way that the ink is. So instead of it being a nice smooth delivery, I ended up with this graded delivery. And then all of a sudden there was a lot of pigment and a lot of ink there, so I went and used that up as well. So once I have 3 or 4 different layers in there, I'm going to go and add another layer of green over top, and that is still the base color, and that's just to get everything to blend nicely within the same color. And then I'll take the color from the skirt and use it up top just to create a little bit of cohesion between those elements as well. Now this pen that I'm using here, this is my one that always explodes. So I have one that I have to wait for the ink, and I have one that is going to have a huge release of ink. And what am I going to do? Okay, well now I'm going to, instead of adding, really fine delicate vines, I'm going to put it upright so that the pigment flows back down into the barrel of the pen. And then I'm going to just add leaves and dots and vines and stuff to this. But because of the saturation of the tip of this, I'm going to have to A, work fast, and B, hold not put any pressure on the barrel of the pen, and I'm going to have to just quickly kind of go over things with dots and less detail than I had intended to do. It's okay that that exploded on the bottom there because I'll just cut it out later. These Peachy Keen stamps are actually really fabulous, and she has the Peachy Keen stamps. They have several different sets of these faces, and within each set comes enough range to be able to fit on every single one of the Julie Nutting dolls, from the largest doll to her smallest doll currently. Each set of Peachy Keen stamps has such a variety of sizes within it that they fit on all of the Julie Nutting dolls. And so this stamp set was my best purchase stamp-wise in a very, very long time. And it's the one that I've definitely gotten the most use out of. So I put a little cheeky face on there, and I'm going over everything just to make sure everything is nicely blended. And then I'm going to redo all of my shadows just to make sure that everything is set. Now, this last layer is going to show up quite a bit darker than the initial layers, and the reason that it does that is because the page is dry. And so there's not as much flow and there's not as much blending happening. It's just going to mostly stay where it's at rather than blending in a grade across the piece. Then I'm adding her lipstick in a nice red, and then I'm going to cut her out. Now, I didn't think you wanted to watch me fussy cut, so I started on one foot, and by the magic of film, I end up going just snap, and I'm done cutting out the next foot. So then I'm going to go through and make sure that everything is going to fit together. And then I'll create the background for this piece. This is a tag from the Prima pad of tags, and I'm going to add some gel medium, and I'm going to take the paper that we had originally picked up the dyes with, and I'm going to add that to the tag. I don't know what really my thought process was. I just kind of added it in chunky color to the page. If you notice, what I'm doing here is I'm laying down the matte gel, and then I'm putting the paper down, and then I'm adding another layer on top. So I'm creating this cohesion from the base layer all the way up to the top, and I'm sealing in the color as well. If I didn't do that, what would end up happening is the color could be moving, and I don't want that to happen. I want the color to stay right where I put it. And the other thing it does is it creates a base layer for me to adhere everything else to that will actually stick. And this is the matte finish, so that makes it just that little bit better for sticking every other element to the page once it's dry. So then what I do is I grab my heat gun and I run that over top to dry it all out and make sure that everything is nicely set so I can move on to my next phase. I could just have set this off to the side right from the beginning and allowed it to air dry, but I decided to use the heat gun instead and just keep the flow of the project going. Now, my heat gun is a paint stripper, so it gets very, very hot, and one of the things to keep in mind when you're using any heat gun or paint stripper or any heat element is to keep it moving. Don't shake it around because it damages the internal elements of the heat tool, but keeping it constantly smoothly moving, it makes it so that the heat is displaced and your project won't melt or bubble or turn brown or catch on fire. So now I'm trying to decide where I'm going to put everything. I'm trying to make sure I have room for all of the elements that I have created for this project, and I'm going to do a quick layout. Now, one of the things I'm using on this is that I don't really trust my glue. Even though I'm using the Aleene's, everything is still wet. My layers are not, perfectly dry from base to top. That's going to take a little while. So because I don't trust my glue, I've decided to reach for brads, and luckily I had brads that went really well with everything, and I'm able to go through and add them in there. Normally when I'm sending out a package, I will stay away from brads just because it adds so much thickness to the project. So then, because I hadn't discovered at this point, I hadn't discovered the Finnabair 3D gel or the Golden Heavy Gel, I'm using the Aleene's Craft Glue. And it works just fine. And it adheres quickly as well. So here I'm placing all of my elements in here. And then my little girl is going to go over top. I'm only smoothing down that center point so that she will go into it. I didn't smooth down the rest of it just because I didn't feel like I needed to. And I am using a bone folder to get all the bubbles out. So once everything is glued together, I'm going to go through with my brads and I'm going to add them to the centers of the flowers. And she has a knot tying on her skirt, so I'm going to add a brad to the knot on her skirt as well. This flower posed a little bit of a problem for me because I realized as I was putting it in there that this is one of the ones that I wanted texture for, but I had already put enough glue on it that it wasn't going to budge. So I just kind of ended up sticking it as it was and continuing on with my process. Here is the brad that goes on her little belt. And then I'm going to start paper piecing all of the other flowers together. Here's my tiered flower. I'm going to put that in there. And then I'm going to put some Aleene's glue onto the other textural flowers that I had there. And I'm going to add them in there too. Now, the center point of this flower became quite large, and so I needed to add some more elements into it. So I decided that 3 brads would do better than the single brad. A single brad looked quite out of place, but adding in 3 brads seemed to bring everything together the way I needed it to be. So here's the textural flowers, and I'm just kind of piecing them together so that each petal is seen so that it does end up working out exactly as I wanted it to. And then I'm going to glue it in underneath this flower to add all of that dimension in there. So I did lay it out, and this happens a lot, especially with scrapbooking and stuff. I'll create all the elements on the page and I'll make it all this perfect, beautiful layout. But unless I snap a picture of it with my cell phone, everything kind of goes together a little bit differently. There's no real, this has to be here and this has to go there. And anytime that you give a whole bunch of elements to somebody and you don't take a picture of how they're going to go together, you know, it's just kind of a crapshoot on what ends up happening. So in general, this is exactly where I was, but it's not exactly how I had originally laid it all out. And then I'm just going to add the brads to the yellow flowers. And as I'm doing this, I'm thinking about what kind of words I'm going to add to this project. And so the words that I decide to add and have been thinking about the whole time are "The rebel in me will never die." And so I go through and find my parchment paper. So the pen that I grabbed here was just my Faber-Castell Pitt pen. It's an India ink pen. It is an archival pen, and it will stay, the ink will stay where I want it to be. And I wanted to reach for my crackle paint, clear crackle paint, and so to create a base layer and a little bit of texture and stuff to this, what I did is ripped it out rather than cutting it out. And then after that, I go through with my Stampin' Up! Ink and a fingertip brayer or a fingertip sponge, and I go around the edges just to create that distressed look to these words. Now, the Stampin' Up! Ink is a water-based ink, so what's going to happen when I add the paint to it is it's going to pull the pigment from the base layer all the way up through the top layer. So while I am adding a clear layer of crackle paint, it's not going to appear to be a clear layer. It's going to pull that pigment up and it's going to make it all this cohesive color. So instead of just having this shiny floating layer on top of the words, it's going to be this shiny floating layer of vintage kind of color and texture. So reach for the crackle paint, and I have to say that This is my favorite crackle paint. It is the Distress Tim Holtz crackle paint. It already has a brush in it. It's a little dip. And you apply it nice and thickly, and then you just allow it to dry on its own. And I haven't had any problems with this crackle paint. I have tried several different crackle paints, and what I'm constantly finding is that they will just flake off of my project as soon as they are dry. And this seems to have a little bit more adherence to it. So I'm going to have to try that out a little bit more. I do have the white and the black in this as well. So I'm going to have to test that out a little bit. But as far as the clear goes, I don't have any complaints about it. It does take some time to dry, and you do need to put a nice thick layer on. But other than that, I don't have any complaints about this kind of crackle paint. So as you saw on the words, I put this nice heavy thick layer, and I'm going to get these nice heavy thick crackles. But I wanted this iridescent kind of look to the wings, and so I thought, you know what, the wing mesh looks a little bit like a crackle kind of thing. So I put a thin layer of this on, not the thick layer that I did on the words, but a thin layer so that it would give the shimmer and a bit of crackle, so it would give the impression of a mesh on the wings. Now, I do have to say that this dried, and the words are all crackly and beautiful and twisted because it was a wet medium onto a parchment paper. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to glue it all down, but I'm going to have to, once I have all the elements assembled and everything is ready to go, I am going to end up putting a book on it until it's dry. Another thing I wanted to say is, if you can see that I have my bottle of Aleene's glue laying down, anytime you have a bottle like that, I see a lot of people will go through and have some sort of holder to hold it upside down. And I don't do that. I put it on its side, and the glue is most of the time readily available until the bottle is empty. I find that when I put my bottle upside down, I forget to close the tip every time, and I end up with a cup full of glue rather than having glue readily available. I have this cup full of glue that eventually solidifies. So all I'm doing is I've grabbed my embroidery floss, and I've grabbed 3 colors that will work well with the color tones that are already in my tag. And I'm going to add them together to create a bit of color and splash at the top of the tag. And on each color, I'm going to add beads, and at the end of those, I'm going to add a little leaf charm. I'm not going to do it on every one. I'm just going to do it on one of each color for those things, so that I have 3 different ones hanging down. And the next thing that I end up doing is snipping all the strings to different lengths to give it a little bit of a tassel-y feel to it. Now, I did record all of this process, but once I started fumbling with the beads and the charm, I realized that my camera had not zoomed in enough. And so I just eliminated the rest of the video from that. I chopped it all out because really all you see is me fumbling with a string. It's hard to see what exactly I'm doing. And so once I have 3 sets of beads and charm on there, my tag is finished. I do end up writing a little bit of a letter to the person I'm sending it to, but otherwise it is complete. Here's a close-up of the flowers and brads. There's the beautiful crackled words, and here's my cheeky little girl on the page. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Mixed Media Monday.